Can Captain Bonnet outwit Blackbeard in a stealthy sea skirmish? Ralph D. Paine, today on the Classic Tales podcast. Welcome to the Classic Tales podcast. Thank you for listening. The Audiobook Library Card is the perfect solution if you can't get enough classic audiobooks. Unlimited downloads and streaming of the entire Classic Tales library for $9.99 a month. It's like Netflix for audiobooks. Use the coupon code ClassicTales2 and save $3 on your first month. You can also subscribe yearly at a lower price if you like. Go to audiobooklibrarycard.com or follow the link in the show notes. I've been building the Classic Tales audiobook library for the last 18 years. Many of the titles have won awards. Only about a quarter of the library has been on the podcast. There are over 300 titles of mystery, adventure, science fiction, horror, literature, and more. With the Audiobook Library Card, you gain access to everything. So head on over to audiobooklibrarycard.com and start listening. And now, Blackbeard Buccaneer, Part 6 of 8, by Ralph D. Paine. Chapter 13. Our Heroes Seek Seclusion. An hour before dawn, the anchor was aweigh, and the Royal James drifted ahead like a shadow, in between the outer islands where the fairway was wide and safe. Her gun ports were open, and every man was alert at his station. It was a silent ship, excepting when the officer passed an order along. Joe Hawkridge began to feel more sanguine of winning against odds. He had never seen such iron discipline as this in the bedlam aboard the Revenge. Stede Bonnet knew how to slacken the reins and when to apply the curb. His men were loyal because he dealt out justice as well as severity. "The captain says we must go below when the action commences, Joe," dismally observed Jack Cockerell. "It goes against the grain, but we will not dispute him," was the sage reply. "We needn't be idle. You can lend a hand with the powder or pass the water buckets to douse the fire if she gets ablaze. And there's the wounded to carry into the cockpit and the blood to mop up, and—" "Enough of that," cried Jack, getting pale about the gills. "You take it like a butcher." "What else is it, you big mooncalf? Set me safe ashore in that Charlestown of yours, and I hope ne'er to see another weapon barring a spoon and a knife to cut my victuals." "There is sense in that," agreed young Master Cockerell. Smartly handled, the brig crept in as far as she dared go, without more light by which to avoid the shallower water. The anchor was dropped to a short cable and buoyed, ready to slip. It was estimated that the distance from Blackbeard's ship was somewhat more than a mile. The stars faded, and the cloudless sky began to take on a roseate hue. The light breeze, which had breathed like a cool zephyr through the night, was dying in languid catspaws. Gradually, the dark outline of coastal swamp and forest was uncurtained, and eager eyes were able to discern the yellow spars and blurred hull of the Revenge against the gloomy background. Stede Bonnet's brig was, of course, pricked out much more sharply with the seaward horizon behind her. To her crew, in this hushed morning, there came a prolonged, shrill note that was like the call of a bird. It trilled with a silvery sweetness, and was repeated over and over again. "A boatswain's pipe," said Captain Bonnet, a hand cupped at his ear. "Blackbeard has sighted us and is mustering his crew." So faint was the breeze that the command was given to man 2 boats and take a hawser from the brig to tow her through the inner channel. Before they were in motion, however, the pearly mist began to roll out of the Cherokee swamp as if a great cauldron were steaming. The weather favored it, heat in the air and little wind. The mist seemed also to rise from the water, hanging low but as thick as a summer fog. It shrouded the coast and Blackbeard's ship, and crept out across the harbor until the brig was enveloped in it. "'Twas like this when we swum ashore and found the pirogue, Captain Bonnet," said Joe Hawkridge. "A curious kind of white smother from the swamp. "How long did it hang thus?" was the impatient query. "When the sun was well up, sir, it seemed to burn away like. It has the same look as the fever-breeding vapours of Darien and Yucatan." Captain Bonnet called his boats back, and was in an ugly humour. There was no towing the brig through this bothersome fog which obscured every mark and left a man bewildered, and instead of surprising Blackbeard unprepared, he would now have time to make his ship ready. However, Stede Bonnet was not a man to wring his hands because a well-laid scheme went wrong. Without delay, the crew was assembled in the waist, and he spoke to them from the break of the poop. "We shall make this weather serve our purpose, lads. Fill the boats, every man to his billet. The mates will see to it that the oars are well muffled. Silence above all things. Nimbly now." There was no need to say more. They fathomed the strategy which would enable them to approach Blackbeard's ship unheard and unseen, and then swarm over her side in a ferocious onslaught. Cheerily they took stock of their weapons, drank a health from a tub of stiff grog, and lined up for Captain Bonnet's inspection. They wore clean clothes, the best they could find in their bags, as has always been the sailor's habit when going into action. The ship was left in charge of the navigator with a few men who were the least stalwart or experienced in such desperate adventures as this. Stede Bonnet was in command of the largest boat to lead the party and single out Blackbeard as his own particular foe. There was a large chance that he might not return, and he therefore left instructions for the disposal of the brig, advising the navigator to take her to Charlestown and there sue for the king's pardon in behalf of those on board. He shook hands with Jack Cockrell and Joe Hawkridge, bade them be careful of their own safety, and with no more ado, took his place in the boat. The flotilla stole away from the brig, sunburned, savage men with bright weapons, for whom life was like a throw of the dice, and the pearly fog concealed them when they had passed no more than a cable length away. So skillfully was the sound of the oars deadened that you would not have guessed that boats were moving across the harbor. "Blackbeard fights like a tiger, but trust Captain Bonnet to outwit him," said Joe Hawkridge, who stood at the brig's rail with Jack at his elbow. "It will be mighty hard waiting," was the tense reply. "We shall know when they find the Revenge. They are not apt to miss her, with a compass in the captain's boat." "Oh, there'll be noise enough. Plaguey queer, eh, Jack, to be a-loafing with nothing to see, like your head was wrapped in a blanket. They ought to fetch alongside Blackbeard in a half-hour. Go turn the sand-glass in the cabin." They fidgeted about in aimless fashion, and fell into talk with the navigator, or artist, as he was called, a middle-aged man who had been a master mariner in the slave trade. He told them a yarn or two of the Guinea coast, but he, too, was restless, and left them to stump up and down the deck and peer toward the shore. Jack dodged into the cabin to watch the sand trickle into the bottom of the glass. Never was a half-hour so long in passing. A yell from Joe Hawkridge recalled him to the deck. He listened, but heard no distant pistol shots or the hoarse uproar of men in mortal combat. Joe raised a warning hand and told him to stand still. There came a faint splash. It might have been a fish leaping, but Joe insisted that it was made by a careless oar. Jack heard it again, and then fancied he caught the softened beat of muffled oars close at hand. "They lost the course. The fog confused them," he said in great disgust. "But why come back this ship?" demanded Joe. "They could lay in wait for the fog to lift a little, and I told Captain Bonnet to bear to the northward if in doubt, and find the shore of the swamp. Then he could coast back to the beach and so strike the Revenge." "Well, here they come, Joe, and there is sure to be a good reason. Mayhap the fog cleared to landward, and they intend to tow the brig in after all." Just then the foremost boat became visible, and behind it was the vague shape of another. The puzzled lads stared and stared, and the hair stiffened on their scalps for sheer horror. These were not the boats from the Royal James. They were filled with Blackbeard's own pirates from the Revenge. The explanation was simple enough. Joe Hawkridge read it at a glance. Blackbeard was not the drunken chucklehead that Stede Bonnet had assumed him to be. He, too, had taken advantage of the fog to attempt to carry the enemy by stealth. The wit of the one had been matched by the other, and the two flotillas had gone wide enough in passing to escape mutual discovery. In a way it was a pirate's comedy, but there were two spectators who foresaw a personal tragedy, They fled for the cabin and scuttled through a small door in a bulkhead which admitted them to the dark hold of the ship. It was their purpose to hide in the remotest nook that could be found. Falling over odds and ends of cargo, they burrowed like rats and stowed themselves behind a tier of mahogany logs which had been taken out of some prize or other. They were in the bottom of the ship, upon the rough floor covering the stone ballast. Then these frightened stowaways found respite to confer in tremulous whispers. "This is the very dreadfulest fix of all, Joe. I had a fair look at Blackbeard himself in the stern of the boat, red ribbons in his whiskers, and his sash stuck full of pistols. That old rip isn't an easy man to mistake, Jack, now the fat is in the fire," replied the Hawkridge lad, who, for once, appeared discouraged. "Captain Bonnet is a vast sight happier than us. He gets the revenge without striking a blow." "But Blackbeard gets us," wailed Master Cockerell. "And I helped to chase him through the swamp after we rammed the pirogue into his wherry and capsized the treasure chest. Do you suppose he knew me just now?" "Those little red eyes of his are passing keen. But didn't you tell me of smearing your face with mud that day to fend off the mosquitoes? That may have disguised you." "A little comfort in that, Joe. But to be found in Stede Bonnet's brig bodes ill enough. Of a truth we be born to trouble, as sparks fly upward ever since we joined the pirates. What is your advice?" "To stay hid below, and pray God for another shift of fortune," piously answered Joe. "There is no fear of Blackbeard's rummaging the hold at present. He must decide if he'll fight the Revenge or give her the slip, and whilst him and his men are busied on deck, I can make bold to search for stores fit to eat. Captain Bonnet always has a well-found ship. Blast it, Jack, my hearty. Stalk us up, and we could lie tucked in the forepeak for a month of Sundays." "But the rats in the darkness, and the stinks, and to be expecting discovery," was Jack's dreary comment. "It would have looked like a parlour to me when I was on that barren quay and sighted Ned Rackham's rogues coming off from the snow," said the other stowaway. He was beginning to recuperate from the shock. They were in a mood for no more speech, but sat in this rayless cavern of a hold and strove to hear any sounds which might indicate the course of events on deck. There was no hubbub of firearms, nor the cries of wounded men. It was foolish to assume that the dozen seamen who had been left to keep the ship would attempt resisting Blackbeard's mob of pirates all primed for slaughter. When quietude seemed to reign all through the ship, Joe Hawkridge whispered this opinion. "If his fancy was to deal with them later, he would pitch the lot down here in the hold. Failing that, Jack, he has offered him the chance to enlist. Being so few, they can't plot mischief, and he has lost the hands he left aboard the Revenge." "But I thought all this crew was true as steel to Stede Bonnet, Joe." "Many a man'll change his mind to save his life," was the reply. "And these lads aren't what you'd call Captain Bonnet's picked men. As for Navigator, Blackbeard needs him to fill Ned Rackham's berth." Soon Joe Hawkridge told Jack to stay where he was. Now was the time to explore the lower part of the ship. Squeezing his comrade's hand in farewell, Joe crawled aft to make his way to a rough bulkhead which walled off a storeroom built next to the cabin. The boys had passed through it in their headlong flight below. Here was kept the bulk of the ship's provisions. Joe Hawkridge had learned of the storeroom through helping the steward hoist out a barrel of pork. With his heart in his throat, the venturesome lad groped like a blind man, grievously barking his shins and his knuckles, until he bumped into the timbers of the bulkhead. Inching himself along, he came to the small door which had been cut into the hold to connect with the main hatch. He had slipped the iron bar behind him during his flight with Jack Cockerell. Pulling the door ajar, he wormed through into the storeroom, which was also dark as midnight. His fingers touched what seemed to be a tierce of beef, but he had no tools to start the head or the hoops. In the same manner he discovered other casks and barrels, but they were utterly useless to him. Here was food enough, he reflected, if a man had teeth to gnaw through oak staves. Now and again he had to cross to the other door, which led into the cabin passageway, and press his ear against a plank to make certain against surprise. Up and down the dark room he blundered, refusing to admit himself beaten. The first bit of cheer was when his foot struck a round object as solid as a round shot, and he picked up a small Dutch cheese. This renewed his courage, and he ransacked the corners on hands and knees. Blackbeard's treasure chest was not half so precious as a side of salted fish, which he ran down by scent, saying to himself, "With this rancid cheese and the slab of ancient cod, you could smell my course a league to wind'ard." In a crumpled sack he found a few pounds of what seemed to be wheat flour, by the feel and taste of it. Poor stuff as it was, dry and uncooked, he added it to his stock. "Rubbishy victuals," he sighed. "They may keep a man alive, but he'll choke to death a swallowing of 'em." Water was the desperate necessity, and it was not to be sought for in the storeroom. There was rum enough, the place reeked with it, but to thirsty throats it was so much liquid fire. Joe was resolved not to return to Jack Cockrell without a few pints of water, if reckless enterprise could procure it. Was the cabin still empty? He stood for a long time and listened, but there was not a sound beyond the door of the passageway. Taking his courage in both hands, he pushed at the door, and it creaked open on rusty hinges. Light as a feather, he moved one foot in front of the other, halted, advanced another step, and so entered the large cabin in which Stede Bonnet had lived with a Spartan simplicity. What Joe coveted was the porous jar, or water monkey, which hung suspended in a netting above the table. It was kept filled, he knew, in order to cool the tepid water from the casks. A heavenly sight it was to him to see the drops sweating on its rounded sides. He snatched it down and was about to make a swift retirement, but still spread upon the table he noted the chart of the Carolina and Virginia coasts, which he had pored over with Stede Bonnet. This he delayed to roll up and tuck under one arm, not that he expected to employ it himself, but to make cruising more difficult for Blackbeard. This bit of strategy held him a moment too long. He shot a glance over his shoulder, alarmed by a tread on the companion ladder. Horrified, he beheld a pair of Spanish boots with scarlet, crinkled Morocco tops, and the encased bandy legs, which were strong and thick. What saved the miserable young Hawkridge was that the occupant of these splendid boots paused halfway down the ladder to shout a profane command or two in those husky accents so feared by all lawful shipmen. Before that sable beard came into his field of vision, the lad was in full stride, running like a whippet, chart under one arm, water jar under the other. He checked himself to ease the door behind him, just as the truculent captor of the Royal James brig reached the foot of the ladder and let his gaze rove about the cabin. Sinking to the floor of the storeroom, Joe was afraid that for once he was about to swoon like a silly maid at sight of a mouse. As he had truly said, this pirating was no trade for a nervous man. Never mind. A miss was as good as a mile. Thankful for the darkness that closed around him, he slung the water monkey over his shoulder in its hammock of netted cord, pushed the side of codfish inside his shirt, poked the chart into his bootleg, put the cheese in the sack atop the flour, and was freighted for his journey through the hold. This he accomplished after great difficulty, and had to whistle and wait for a response before he could be sure of Jack Cockrell's whereabouts. "What luck, Joe?" was the plaintive question. "I'd sooner starve than be left alone in this dungeon." "Behold the dashing prentice boy with another hairbreadth escape to his credit," replied the hero. "Be thankful for your dinner, 'cause Blackbeard all but made a mouthful of me." "You saw him, Joe?" "Up to the middle of him, and that was a plenty. Don't ask me. I had a bad turn." "I feel sick too," said Jack. "The smell of this vile bilge water breeds a nausea, and phew, 'tis worse than ever." "Bilge my eye! You sniffed the banquet I fetched ye. Here's a prime cheese that was hatched when Trimble Rogers was a pup." Jack offered a feeble apology, and felt revived after a pull at the water monkey. What they craved most was a spark of light, the glimmer of a candle to lift this appalling gloom, which pressed down like a visible burden. With nothing to do but discuss the situation from every slant and angle of conjecture, it was Joe Hawkridge's theory that Stede Bonnet would not rest content with regaining the Revenge, but would come out to attack the brig as soon as the wind favored. His hatred of Blackbeard was one motive, but there was a point of honor even more compelling. "He called you his guest, Jack," explained Joe, "and I never did see a man so jealous of his plighted word when once he swore it. He took obligation to set you safe in Charlestown, you see, and powder smoke won't stop him."
"Will Blackbeard tarry for a fight, Joe?"
"Not to my notion. He knows well this brig is no match for the Revenge. Knows it better than did Captain Bonnet, what with all the heavy metal slung aboard from the sloop. And what does Blackbeard gain by having this brig hammered into a cocked hat? Fate tricked him comically with this swapping about of ships."
"And will he linger on this coast? Oh, Joe, if he goes for a long cruise, what in mercy's name becomes of us two?"
"A long cruise, it looks like, shipmate. In the Revenge he could laugh at the small king's men-of-war commissioned to hunt him down. He was ready to slap alongside any of 'em. Now it is different. As another flea in his ear, I stole the only chart of these waters. To the southward he'll turn, and I will bet that rampageous cheese on it."
"Clear to the Bay of Honduras?"
said Jack. "As far as that, at a guess. Or he may skirt the Floridas to look for Spanish prizes, and put in at the Dry Tortugas, which is a famous rendezvous for pirates of the Main. He will be hot to fit himself with a bigger ship, by capture or by some knavish trick such as he dealt Captain Bonnet." Chapter 14. Blackbeard appears in fire and brimstone. Here was a tragic predicament from which there was no release. Jack Cockrell was firmly convinced that Blackbeard must have recognized him that day in the swamp, when Joe felt no less certain that he was marked for death because he had been one of the party of marooned mutineers. The hope of prolonging their existence by means of raiding the storeroom had ebbed after Joe's investigation. Such provisions as had been broken out of bulk were kept in lockers and pantries on deck, where they were convenient to the galley and forecastle. It was realized also that their twittering nerves could not long withstand the darkness and suspense once the brig had put out to sea. Joe Hawkridge had nothing more to say about enduring a month of Sundays. While the brig remained at anchor, they clung to the thought that Captain Stede Bonnet might intervene in their behalf. It did bring them a gleam of solace to imagine him hoisting sail on the Revenge and crowding out to rake the brig with his formidable broadsides. And yet they were in doubt whether the Revenge was fit to proceed at once, what with all the work there had been to do, rigging a new foremast, caulking leaky seams, repairing the other ravages of the storm. These pitiable stowaways had no means of telling 1 hour from another, until at length they heard over their heads the faint musical strokes of the ship's bell on the forecastle head. This led them to believe that the fog had cleared, else Blackbeard would not have revealed the vessel's position. And lifting fog meant a breeze to sweep it away from the harbor. "8 bells she strikes, the first of the forenoon watch," said Joe. "We have been cooped in this black pit a matter of 3 hours already." "No more than that," groaned Jack. "It seems at least a week. We must divert ourselves in some wise. What say if I learn you a bit of Latin, and you can say over such sea songs as come to mind, for me to tuck in my memory?" "Well said, my worthy scholar. 'Tis high time we bowled ahead with my education as a proper gentleman." Jack began to conjugate amo, amas, amat, and the pupil droned it after him, but the verb to love recalled a black-eyed lass who had stolen his heart in the Azores, and he veered from the Latin lesson to confide that sentimental passage. So Jack hammered nouns of the first declension into him until they grew tired of that, and then the sea waif played his part by reciting such forecastle ballads as Neptune's Raging Fury, or The Gallant Seaman's Sufferings, and Sir Walter Raleigh's Sailing in the Lowlands. This was better than the slow agony of waiting in silence, but Joe spoiled it by turning lovelorn, and Jack bemoaned fair Dorothy Stewart of Charlestown, whom he would never greet again, and they sang very softly together a verse of The Maid's Lamentation, which went like this: "There shall be no scarf go on my head, no comb in my hair, no fire burn, no candle light, to shew my beauty fair. For never will I married be, until the day I die, since the seas and the winds has parted my love and me." This left them really in worse spirits than before, and they drowsed off to sleep, and no wonder, after such a night as they had passed. Accustomed to broken watches, Joe Hawkridge slept uneasily with one ear open. Once or twice he sat up, heard Jack's steady snores, and lay down again. It was the ship's bell which finally brought him to, and he counted the strokes.
5 bells, but what watch is it? He muttered anxiously. How long was I napping? Lost track of time, so I have. I can't say if it's night or day.
He sat blinking into the darkness, and then had an inspiration. So staunch and well-kept was the brig that the deck seams were tight, and no light filtered through. Joe left his hiding place and groped along to where he thought the main hatch ought to be. Gazing upward, he saw a gleam like a silvered line between the coaming and the edge of the canvas cover, which was battened with iron bars. This persuaded him that the day had not yet faded, and he concluded that they had heard the bell strike either in the afternoon watch or the second dog watch of early evening. This he imparted to Jack, after prodding him awake. They mulled it over, and agreed that Captain Bonnet must have found the Revenge unready to weigh anchor, or he would have engaged the brig ere this. Perhaps there was not breeze enough for either vessel to move. Another hour of this stressful tedium, and they heard a sound of sharp significance. It was the lap-lap of water against the vessel's side. No more than the thickness of the planking was between them and this tinkling sea, and Joe exclaimed in an agitated whisper, "A breeze of wind! Gentle it draws, but steady, like it comes off the land at sundown. The same as it did when we were blown offshore on the little raft, after we quitted the Plymouth Adventure," replied Jack.
"Blackbeard will take advantage of it to make for the open sea. There be 3 things offered us, Master Cockerel: to starve, or go mad in this blighted hold, to sally on deck and beg mercy, which means a short shift, or to climb out softly in the night and try to swim for it."
"Swim to what, Joe?"
"Swim to the bottom, most likely. But we might fetch one of them cays or the coast itself, if he steers close in to find smooth water. 'Tis the worst odds yet, but I'd sooner drown than tarry in this vessel. One miracle was wrought when the cask came drifting to the beach to save me, and who knows but the Lord can spare another one for the salvation of us poor lads that mean to do right and forsake pirating."
As they expected, there came soon the familiar racket of making sail and trimming yards, and the clank of the capstan pawls. Then the anchor fluke scraped and banged against the bow timbers. The vessel heeled a little, and the lapping water changed its tune to a swash, swash, as the hull pushed it aside. The brig was alive and in motion.
"She makes no more than 2 or 3 knots," observed Joe after a little while. "You can tell by the feel of her. The wind is steady but small."
"Then he can't go clear of the islands till long after night," thankfully returned Jack. Joe made another trip to crane his neck at the main hatch. The bright thread of daylight had dimmed. He could scarce discern it. The lads occupied themselves with reckoning the distance, the hour, and the vessel's speed. Now that Joe had satisfied himself that the end of the day was near, he knew what the ship's bell meant when it was struck every half hour. They would await the passing of another hour, until 2 bells of the first watch, by which time they calculated the brig should be in the wide outer channel between the seaward islands. The plan was to emerge through the forepeak in the very bows of the ship, where a scuttle was let into the deck. There they might hope to lower themselves to the chainstays under the bowsprit, and so drop into the sea. They would be washed past the ship, close to her side, and into the wake, and there was little chance of drawing attention. True it was that in this hard choice they preferred to swim to the bottom, if so it had to be. They crouched where they were hid, waiting to hear the fateful signal of 2 bells. It struck, mellow, clear, and they were about to creep in the direction of the forepeak. But Joe Hawkridge gripped his comrade's arm and held him fast. A whispered warning, and they ceased to move. Behind them, in the after part of the ship, gleamed a lantern. It illumined the open door of the bulkhead, which walled off the storeroom, and in this doorway, like a life-sized portrait, grotesque and sinister, set in a frame, was the figure of Blackbeard. He advanced into the hold, and the cowering stowaways assumed that he had come to search them out. The impulse was to dash into the forepeak and so plunge overboard, flinging away all caution. But before their palsied muscles could respond, the behavior of Blackbeard held them irresolute and curious. He had turned his back to them and was shouting boisterously to others to follow him. 7 men came through the doorway, one after the other, hanging back with evident reluctance. It was impossible to discern who they were, whether officers or seamen. Everyone carried in his arms what looked to be a tub or an iron pot. These they set upon the dunnage boards which covered the ballast and made a flooring in the hold. Blackbeard bellowed at them to squat in a circle, which they meekly did. He was in one of his fiendishly mirthful humors, rumpling his beard, strutting to and fro, laughing in senseless outbursts. At such times his men were most fearful for their lives. What sort of an infernal pastime he had now concocted was beyond the imagination of the lads who were concealed a dozen yards away. He was not hunting them. This much was plain, and it seemed wise to be quiet and avoid drawing attention to themselves. They saw Blackbeard ignite a torch at the lantern and poke it into one pot after another. Flames began to burn, blue and green and yellow, and lurid smoke rolled to the deck beams overhead. Amid this glare and reek of combustibles, Blackbeard waved his torch and tremendously proclaimed,
"Come, lads, we be all devils together, with a hell of our own, brimstone fires and pitch. Now, braggarts, see how long ye can bear it. 'Tis a foretaste of what's in store for all hands. At this game I'll outlast ye, for harkye, I sold my soul to the old scratch, as is well known."
He stirred his infernal pots, and the greasy smoke rolled upward in choking volume. The brimstone fumes were so vile and noxious that the victims of this outlandish revel soon gasped and wheezed, but they dared not object, nor move from their places among the villainous pots. Blackbeard enjoyed their sufferings, taunting them as milksops and poltroons, who could not endure even this taste of Gehenna. He himself appeared to be unaffected by it, lurching from one man to another, whacking them with the burning torch, or playfully upsetting them. In a gaseous pall of smoke, he loomed like the Belial, whom he was so fond of claiming as his mentor. Finally, one of his involuntary guests toppled over in a faint. Blackbeard was kind enough to haul him to the door and boot him through it. A second man dragged himself thither. A third found voice to supplicate. The witch fires still smoked and stewed in the pots, and Blackbeard had proved that he was the toughest demon of them all. The 2 stowaways watched this demented exploit in sheer wonderment. The fumes were not dense in their part of the hold, and they could breathe, but they well-nigh strangled in trying to refrain from coughing. The fires of tar and brimstone and what-not cast so much light that they dared not betray themselves by crawling toward the forepeak. The upright beams between the keelson and the deck threw black shadows over them, and they were in no great peril of detection so long as they stayed motionless. Joe Hawkridge had heard gossip of this extraordinary amusement as a kind of initiation for hands newly joining Blackbeard's ship. He therefore read it that these unfortunates were some of Stede Bonnet's men who had been captured with the brig. They had been allowed to enlist and were being taught to respect their new master. Jack Cockrell had hugely admired young Joe for his ready wit and coolness in other crises of their mutual fortunes. But now came a moment in which the astute sea urchin surpassed himself. It was not too much to say that he displayed absolute genius with the sturdy Master Cockrell to aid and abet him. Joe clawed in the dark until he found the sack with a few pounds of wheat flour in it. A quick whisper to his comrade grasped the great idea. They took no thought of a sequel. They would trust to opportunity. Hastily they rubbed the flour onto their shirts and breeches. They covered their faces with it and lavishly sprinkled their hair. They looked at each other in the shadow of the beams and were pleased with their handiwork. Another whispered consultation, and Joe possessed himself of the cannonball of a cheese, while Jack grasped the side of saltfish by the tail. They resembled 2 whitened clowns of a pantomime, but in spirit they were as grimly serious as the menace of death could make them. Blackbeard was dancing clumsily like a drunken bear, and deriding with lewd oaths the 2 or 3 tortured survivors of his brimstone carnival. In a high, wailing voice which rose to a shriek, there was borne to him the words, "He dirked poor Jessie Strawn and left him rotting in the swamp. I was a true and faithful seaman, Captain Teach." A deeper voice boomed out, filling the hold with unearthly echoes. "I am the shade of the master mariner, whom ye did foully murder off Mantanzas, and there is no rest for me 10 fathom down." The apparitions flitted out of the shadow, and were vaguely disclosed in the flickering glare from the brimstone pots. The smoke gave them a wavering aspect, as though their shapes were unsubstantial. Blackbeard stood beholding them in a trance of horror. With an aimless finger, he traced the sign of the cross, and his pallid lips moved in the murmur.
"The ghost of Jessie Strawn. For the love of God, forbear!"
It was a petition as pious as ever Christian uttered. Forgotten was his wicked counterfeit of the nether region. Again the shrill voice wailed, "Pity poor Jessie Strawn! I'll haunt ye by land and sea, Captain Teach. Swear by the book to let that treasure chest lie at the bottom of the creek, else I tear your sinful soul from your body." The terrible Blackbeard was incapable of motion. Huskily, he muttered,
"I'll ne'er seek the chest, good Jessie Strawn, and it please you to pass me by."
The two spectres moved forward as the one of the deeper voice declaimed, "Doomed I was to find no rest till I overtook your ship, Edward Teach. Each night you'll see me walk the plank from your quarter-deck." The unhappy Blackbeard gibbered something, and would have fled as the spirits approached him. But those bandy legs tottered, and before he could turn, the awful visitants were upon him. One raised a round shot above his head, or so it appeared to be, and smote him full upon the crown. The other whirled a flat bludgeon and hit him on the jaw. With the smell of brimstone was mingled the pungent flavor of ripe cheese and salt fish. Blackbeard measured his length, and the ghost of Jessie Strawn delayed an instant to dump a pot of sizzling combustibles over him. Then the spirits twain made for the cabin at top speed. Several of the crew had rushed down to hearken to the strange disturbance. They scattered wildly at the first glimpse of these phantoms, being superstitious sailormen with many a wicked deed to answer for. It flashed into Joe Hawkridge's mind that all the men of the watch might be chased below, the hatches clapped on them, and the mastery of the brig secured. Blackbeard was absent for reasons best known to himself, and his pirates lacked leadership. A brace of ghosts could put them to panic rout. And, no doubt, that wailing message of dead Jessie Strawn had carried like the cry of a banshee. The poop was deserted in the twinkling of an eye, even to the pair of helmsmen and the officer of the watch. Against the sky of night the unwelcome phantoms were wan and luminous, while the groans which issued from them were enough to curdle the blood of the brawniest pirate. He who had been Jack Cockrell in mortal guise was quick to slide the cabin hatch closed and fasten it. For the moment, they had captured the armed brig Royal James, and as ferocious a crew of rascals as ever scuttled a merchantman. Joe Hawkridge glided to the taffrail and peered over the stern. A boat was towing behind the ship. It had been left there for taking soundings or pulling the brig's head around while she was still in the shoaler waters near the coast. This was better than Joe had dared anticipate. Feeling his way along the rail, he found the end of the rope, which was belayed around a wooden pin. Heaven be praised, they would not have to swim for it. He beckoned his comrade to say in his ear, "They will soon find their wits. It'll be foolish to try scaring them under hatches now that the jolly boat floats so handy. There's hard cases amongst them that will begin shooting at us presently. Down the rope you go, Jack. I'll stand by and give 'em another dose of poor Jessie Strawn." Over the rail flew the stouter phantom of the two, and slid like a white streak, fetching up in the boat with a most earthly and substantial thump. With a farewell wail, the other ghost flung a limber leg over and shot down so fast that his hands were scorched. To such pirates as beheld this instant vanishment, these disturbing spirits floated off into space. Jack cut the rope with his knife, and the boat dropped back in the shining wake. They shoved out 2 heavy oars and fairly broke their hearts in pulling dead into the wind, where the brig would have to tack to pursue them. The rattle of the oars and the discovery of the shorn rope's end must have convinced the pirates who ran aft that they had been tricked by mortal beings like themselves. A musket spat a red streak of fire. blocks whined as the braces were hauled to change the brig's course. In the light breeze she responded awkwardly, and soon hung in stays. Meanwhile, the jolly boat was slowly working to windward, while two frightened lads tugged and swung until the flour turned to paste on their dripping faces. Before the brig began to forge ahead, the boat was invisible from her decks. This was evident because the sputter of musket fire ceased. Soon the fugitives heard Blackbeard's harsh voice damning all hands. That thick skull of his had not been cracked by the impact of the solid cheese, and he had been released from his brimstone inferno. The ghosts rested on their oars. They could watch the glimmering canvas of the brig and see what her procedure might be. Soon she filled away and forsook the attempt to find the boat. Blackbeard had wisdom enough to avoid blundering about and putting the brig aground in a chase so elusive as this. "Farewell, ye hairy son of Tophet," said Joe Hawkridge, waving his hand at the disappearing vessel. "And here's hoping I set your whiskers ablaze when I turn the pot over 'em." "Did you hear him swear not to touch the treasure chest, Joe? That was a master stroke of yours." "Aye, it was bright to me, but he thinks different now. He knows we made a booby of him." "But we learned one thing. He hasn't recovered the treasure yet," suggested Jack. "He is such a powerful liar that I don't know as the ghost of Jesse Strawn could budge the truth out of him. However, it was comforting to hear him swear it on his marrow bones. I fetched away the navigation chart, the one I poached from the cabin table. It gives us the lay of the coast." "What ho! And whither bound?" was Jack's question. "Here is a sail wound round a sprit beneath the thwarts." "The wrong wind ahead for Captain Bonnet and the Revenge. This swag-bellied jolly boat handles like a firkin. We had best wait for day, and then decide the voyage." "Nothing to eat and no water, Joe. All I can find is an empty pannikin." "You're a glutton," severely exclaimed young Hawkridge. "After the banquet I served in the hold?" What Master Cockerel said in reply sounds as familiar and as wistful today as when he spoke it 200 years ago. "I have had enough of wandering and strange adventures, Joe. I want to go home." This is B.J. Harrison. I hope you've enjoyed this unabridged production of Blackbeard Buccaneer Part 6 of 8 by Ralph D. Paine. If you've enjoyed this book, you might also enjoy Beleriand by Raphael Sabatini. And you can listen to all the pirate tales you want with your Audiobook Library Card. Steer yourself over to audiobooklibrarycard.com now and click the appropriate button. Use the coupon code ClassicTales2 and save $3 on your first month. Thank you for joining me today and allowing classic literature to awaken your better self. Please join me next time, and we'll rediscover the greatest stories ever put to paper.